The sky over Oro Bay was empty of clouds on the morning of March 11th, 1943, clean, bright, and deceptively calm. 14,000 feet below, the Bismarck Sea still carried the aftertaste of recent slaughter. Scorched oil on the water, scattered wreckage, a faint smear of smoke where ships had burned in the first week of March. Up here, at 19,000 feet, a Japanese fighter section climbed in loose steps, engines laboring as the air thinned. They were hunting American aircraft reported inbound from Port Moresby. What they found instead were twin shapes higher up, fast, angular, unmistakable. P-38 Lightnings. Two of them moving hard across the climb path, not head-on, not fleeing, but cutting the geometry like they owned it. The Japanese pilots had seen American fear before. Fighters glued to bombers, turning wide, defensive circles, unwilling to break formation. These Lightnings weren't doing that. They were orbiting at altitude in tight, patient loops, conserving speed, holding height, waiting. The posture said something every veteran could read. We are not reacting. We are choosing. That should have been impossible. In 1942, the Zero was the superior fighter in the metrics pilots actually felt. It turned inside almost anything. It climbed quickly from low altitude. It rolled cleanly. Its control surfaces answered with the slightest pressure, as if the airplane anticipated the hand on the stick. American combat reports from the Philippines to Darwin to the Coral Sea repeated the same lesson until it became a rule carved into doctrine. If you tried to turn with a Zero, you died. Many died learning it. The survivors wrote it down. So the first instinct, when you saw two enemy fighters above you, was to climb for position, then force the fight into the horizontal. That was where Zero skill mattered, where training, reflexes, and aircraft harmony could turn one mistake into a kill. Two Lightnings didn't scare a seasoned section. Two Lightnings looked like an opportunity to prove again that the Zero's reputation was earned. The P-38, after all, was a strange counterpoint. Twin engines, twin booms. A cockpit pod hung between them like a gondola. It was bigger, heavier, and unwilling to dance in tight circles. Early on, pilots who tried to dogfight Zeros the old way discovered that a Lightning's wide turn radius could become a death sentence. In some squadrons, the jokes turned dark. Potential didn't win fights. Survivors did. Yet the P-38 carried a different kind of advantage, one that didn't show up in turning diagrams. Its two Allison engines were turbo-supercharged, designed to keep power as altitude increased. The Zero's engine was not. At lower altitudes, the Zero could feel unstoppable, quick, eager, responsive. But above 18,000 feet, a different reality began to assert itself. The air thinned, the engine strained, and every vertical choice cost more speed than the airframe could easily afford. The Japanese section continued climbing anyway, trying to force the engagement into a pure climb where the Zero's reputation felt safest. The Lightnings answered by doing something that looked like retreat. They leveled, accelerated, and let the distance open. An invitation. The Zeros took it, throttles forward, nose down a few degrees, airspeed building. The chase tightened. The Americans still didn't turn. Then both P-38s pitched up, hard, violent zoom climbs that turned speed into altitude in seconds. The move wasn't a turn at all. It was a conversion. 400 miles per hour became vertical velocity. The Lightning shot through 22,000 feet, then 24, then 26, their speed bleeding off in a controlled arc, right on the edge of stall. The Zeros tried to follow, but high in thin air, the climb felt different, slower, mushier, and expensive. Every extra 1,000 feet cost speed the Zero could not easily get back. At the top, the Lightnings rolled inverted, split left and right, and dove back down with shocking acceleration. One came out of the sun like a dropped hammer and fired at roughly 400 yards. The P-38's guns were grouped in the nose. Tight, center-line fire with no convergence guesswork, and a zero ahead of the formation simply disintegrated. No prolonged duel, no heroic spiral, a pass, a burst, and an aircraft ceasing to exist. What happened over Oro Bay wasn't luck. It was energy management made lethal. A fighter's real currency is energy, altitude and speed you can trade, store, and spend. At sea level, the Zero's light airframe made it a champion. Up here, its engine was bleeding strength. The P-38's turbos kept the Allison strong, which meant the Lightning could dive fast, zoom high, roll over, and do it again without going bankrupt. The Zero could not. Each attempt to follow the vertical move stole more speed than it could recover in time. Somewhere in New Guinea, pilots had begun building a method around that imbalance. Not a romantic dogfight, but a system. Bait the chase, climb vertically out of reach, roll, dive through at high speed, strike, and reset above the enemy before he can finish his turn. Later, people would give it names. In practice, it was a simple refusal. Refusal to fight fair, refusal to fight horizontal, refusal to hand the Zero the duel it was designed to win. And once veterans recognized the pattern, many stopped committing upward at all, because commitment meant dying without return. That refusal didn't appear overnight, and it didn't come from strategists in Brisbane. It came from the oldest engine of innovation in war. Units that are bleeding, pilots who are tired of burying friends, and a machine that only becomes dangerous once you stop asking it to be something it isn't. In late 1942, the 5th Air Force fought a rough, improvised campaign across New Guinea. Airfields were mud and pierced steel planking hacked out of jungle. Engines corroded in heat and rain. Pilots flew until their hands shook, then flew again because there weren't enough replacements. In that environment, the Zero wasn't a myth. It was a pattern. Zeros arrived fast, turned tighter, and punished anyone who tried to prove courage in a horizontal circle. The P-38 Lightning was supposed to change the pattern. On paper, it had speed, range, and concentrated firepower. In practice, early encounters exposed its weaknesses. It was heavy. Its roll rate could feel slow. Its turn radius was wide. A pilot who tried to dogfight a Zero in the old style often discovered he was dragging a larger airplane through a smaller man's game. What saved the Lightning wasn't a new wing or a magical upgrade. It was a shift in what pilots considered good fighting. Instead of asking, "Can I outturn him?" they started asking, "Can I control the first 5 seconds?" Because the first 5 seconds decide whether the rest of the fight happens on your terms or his. By December 1942, P-38 units were already experimenting with altitude discipline around Buna and Dobodura. Japanese raids often came in low, then climbed out toward home. When Lightnings met them with height in hand, they could dive, fire, and climb away before Zeros could settle into a turning solution. The engagement looked brief and almost impersonal. Passes, bursts, separation. But brief was the point. The Zero wanted you slow and close. The Lightning wanted you fast and gone. Then March 1943 raised the stakes. During the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Allied aircraft shattered a Japanese convoy bound for Leh. Above the bombers, Zeros tried to drag escorts down to the altitude band where the Zero was happiest. P-38s that stayed low and tight with the formation got pulled into turning chaos. P-38s that stayed higher, top cover with room to dive, could strike on the way in, climb out, and strike again. This was the doorway to the vertical trap. A few leaders began treating altitude like money in a bank. Spend it to attack, then regain it immediately, because the next attack depends on having it again. In the 39th Fighter Squadron, Captain Thomas Lynch was among the men pushing this thinking hard. His rule for new pilots was brutally simple. If you find yourself turning with a zero, you're already late. Don't try to be braver. Try to be higher and faster. Major Edward Porky Cragg, another experienced P-38 leader, carried the same practical philosophy. The Lightning wasn't unbeatable, but it could choose. A zero could outturn you. It could outclimb you from sea level. What it could not reliably do was follow repeated vertical conversions at altitude without bleeding energy it could not replace. That's the trap. The bait is psychological as much as mechanical. You let the enemy believe he has forced you into a chase, the pure pursuit he understands. You allow the distance to open just enough to feel like retreat. Then you change the plane. Instead of turning, you climb. Instead of circling, you convert speed into altitude. The zero pilot faces a dilemma he didn't practice for. Follow and stall early, or refuse and watch the Lightning reset above him. Either choice leaves him vulnerable. Inside the 5th Air Force, doctrine lagged behind experience. Many commanders wanted fighters welded to bomber formations. Stay close, stay disciplined, don't chase. The logic was reasonable. The geometry was deadly. Close escort pinned P-38s to bomber altitude, often 12 to 15,000 feet, and robbed them of the altitude reserve needed to dive and zoom. When a zero attacked, the escort was forced to react flat in the enemy's preferred arena. General George Kenney encouraged aggressive escort once results showed, letting fighters hold top cover. That permission turned improvisation into habit and habit into doctrine. So early 1943 became a quiet argument in the sky. Pilots who flew the book lost airplanes. Pilots who cheated upwards survived and sometimes won. Some wrote memos. Some just flew the way that kept men alive. Out of that argument, the vertical trap became a system. Dive, fire, zoom, roll, dive again. A repeatable sequence that turned the Lightning from too heavy to dogfight into a weapon that dictated terms. Not because it fought harder than the zero, but because it stopped fighting the zero's fight at all. By the spring of 1943, the vertical trap had stopped being an experiment and started becoming a pattern. One Japanese pilots could recognize even if they couldn't defeat it. The fight was no longer decided by who could turn tighter or climb faster in the first few seconds. It was decided by who arrived at the engagement with energy already banked and who was forced to spend it just to stay alive. The mathematics behind it were unforgiving. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine delivered its best performance close to sea level. As altitude increased, power fell off sharply. Above 18,000 feet, the aircraft still flew, but every climb cost disproportionate speed. At 25,000 feet, the Zero was operating with hundreds of horsepower, less than it had at low altitude. Controls grew heavy. Acceleration slowed. Recovery from vertical mistakes took longer. The P-38 lived in a different world. Its turbo-supercharged Allison engines maintained power well past altitudes where the Zero began to struggle. That meant a Lightning starting a dive from 25 or 28,000 feet could enter the fight carrying enormous kinetic energy. 400 miles per hour wasn't just speed, it was stored altitude waiting to be reclaimed. After the firing pass, the pilot could pull up into a steep climb, trade that speed back into height, and emerge again above the fight, ready to repeat the cycle. This is where the trap closed. A Zero climbing to intercept arrived slow, perhaps 160 to 180 knots, already behind the energy curve. A P-38 diving through the engagement arrived fast enough to choose its firing window and fast enough to leave before retaliation mattered. The Zero could not mirror that exchange. It could climb well initially, but it bled speed rapidly in sustained vertical maneuvers. Once slow, it stayed slow. In practice, a vertical trap engagement unfolded in stages. The Lightning flight began high and loose, 3,000 to 5,000 feet above the expected intercept altitude. When Japanese fighters committed, either climbing toward the bombers below or chasing the Lightnings themselves, The Americans dove, not straight down, but at a controlled angle that built speed without overstressing the airframe. Closure happened in seconds. At 600 yards, sometimes less, the P-38s pulled up hard, converting horizontal speed into vertical climb right through the enemy's altitude. The Zero pilot faced an impossible decision: follow the climb and risk stalling early, losing control, and becoming a stationary target on the next dive, or refuse the climb and watch the lightning reset above him. Either way, the American fighter ended up where it wanted to be: higher, faster, and in control of the next move. At the top of the zoom, the P-38 slowed, but not helplessly. The pilot paused only long enough to assess, sometimes seconds, then rolled inverted and dove again. The Zero below was still maneuvering, still trying to recover speed, still reacting. The lightning came down through the engagement like a pendulum, fast enough that tracking it for a clean shot was nearly impossible. The lethality was amplified by the P-38's armament. 450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose, meant every round went where the pilot aimed. There was no convergence distance to guess, no spread to manage. At 400 yards, a short burst could be decisive. The Zero's light construction, lack of armor, and unprotected fuel tanks made even brief hits catastrophic. Some aircraft exploded, others shed wings or control surfaces under stress they were never designed to endure. From the cockpit of a Zero, the experience felt less like combat and more like exposure. There was rarely time to settle into a duel. The attacker arrived already moving too fast, fired, and was gone again. Turning to evade often made things worse. A high-G brake turn at 200 knots could overstress an already damaged airframe. Freezing meant accepting the burst. Within weeks, Japanese pilots began reporting a pattern. American fighters that refused horizontal combat, engaged only in high-speed passes, and climbed away before retaliation. Some called it yo-yo fighting. Others described it as unfair. Both descriptions were accurate. The Zero had been designed to win a particular kind of fight. The vertical trap denied that fight entirely. Training magnified the problem. Japanese naval aviation doctrine emphasized close engagement, tight turns, and aggressive pursuit. Energy management in the vertical plane was not a focus. New pilots arriving in 1943 often had half the flight hours of their American counterparts and little preparation for opponents who would not slow down to be caught. Their first encounters with vertical trap tactics were often lethal lessons. The psychological effect spread faster than the tactical one. Veteran pilots began breaking off climbs earlier. Flights became more cautious. Engagements were avoided unless altitude advantage was clear, and it rarely was. American P-38s increasingly began missions already high, cruising at 25,000 feet or more, diving into combat and zooming back out. Japanese pilots starting lower, escorting bombers or scrambling to intercept, were always reacting, always chasing an opponent who chose when to appear and when to leave. By early summer 1943, the outcome of many encounters was decided before a shot was fired. If the P-38s held altitude and speed, Zero pilots understood the risk. Committing meant entering a cycle they could not escape. Refusing meant abandoning the mission. Either choice carried consequences, but one at least preserved pilots and aircraft. This was the quiet moment when Zero aces began to quit the fight, not in cowardice, but in calculation. The vertical trap had turned air combat into applied physics. Skill still mattered, but only within the boundaries the P-38 imposed. Outside those boundaries, courage and talent could not overcome energy loss. The sky over New Guinea was becoming a place where one side attacked and the other endured, and endurance was running out. As the vertical trap spread, its effects stopped being anecdotal and started appearing in unit records. What had begun as individual survival tactics hardened into measurable outcomes: kill ratios, loss rates, mission aborts, and eventually withdrawals. The sky over New Guinea did not change because the P-38 suddenly became perfect. It changed because the fight itself was reshaped into one the Zero could not afford to enter. In early 1943, 5th Air Force squadrons were still paying for old habits. Close escort missions pinned fighters to bomber altitude, forcing engagements into the Zero's comfort zone. Losses mounted. In February alone, some P-38 units lost aircraft weekly, often without achieving corresponding kills. The lesson was written in wreckage. Altitude was not optional, it was survival. When high-cover tactics were finally authorized, the effect was immediate. P-38 flights positioned several thousand feet above bomber formations were no longer reactive. They could see intercepts forming, dive to disrupt them, and climb back out before the fight collapsed into a turning brawl. Japanese pilots found themselves under attack before they reached firing position, forced to maneuver defensively while still climbing. The numbers reflected the shift. By late spring and early summer 1943, P-38 equipped squadrons were achieving consistent positive kill ratios against Zero units over New Guinea. Some units reported 5-to-1 outcomes over sustained periods. These were not isolated victories or lucky days. They were the predictable result of repeated vertical engagements fought from a position of energy dominance. The 475th Fighter Group, formed in May 1943 and equipped entirely with P-38s, entered combat already trained in high-altitude vertical tactics. From its first missions, it operated differently than earlier units. Pilots cruised high, attacked selectively, and disengaged aggressively once speed was spent. Losses dropped. Confirmed kills rose. The pattern reinforced itself. Success validated the tactic, and the tactic produced more success. On the Japanese side, the impact accumulated quietly and relentlessly. Units like the 204th Air Group, once among the most capable in the theater, began reporting rising aircraft losses coupled with declining mission effectiveness. Intercepts that had once been aggressive turned cautious. Formations broke earlier. Engagements ended sooner. Pilots returned with empty guns and no victories to show for them. Maintenance compounded the problem. Aircraft damaged but not destroyed by high-speed passes often required extensive repair. Replacement parts arrived slowly. Ground crews worked continuously to keep machines operational, but the pace of attrition outstripped supply. By mid-1943, significant portions of some Japanese fighter units were grounded, not because pilots lacked courage, but because aircraft could not be kept airworthy. Fatigue accelerated the decline. With fewer pilots available, survivors flew more missions. Flying 4 or 5 sorties a day was not uncommon. Each mission carried the same dilemma: engage P-38s and risk unsustainable losses, or avoid them and fail to protect bombers and bases. Neither choice led to recovery. Combat reports from Japanese units began to shift in tone. Early war confidence gave way to technical frustration. American fighters were described as fast, high, and unwilling to engage in turning combat. The language mattered. Turning combat was where Zero pilots believed skill resided. When the enemy refused that arena, it felt less like defeat and more like exclusion, being locked out of the fight you were trained to win. Mission abort rates climbed. Flights disengaged earlier. Some engagements were avoided entirely if American fighters held clear altitude advantage. These decisions were rational. They were also corrosive. Air superiority depends not only on aircraft numbers, but on willingness to contest the sky. As that willingness eroded, American bombers encountered less resistance. Raids that had once drawn dozens of interceptors now faced only a handful. By late summer 1943, the spiral became unmistakable. Losses reduced aircraft availability. Reduced availability increased pilot workload. Increased workload amplified errors. Errors produced more losses. The vertical trap did not need to destroy every Zero in the air. It only needed to make continued engagement irrational. Japanese commanders recognized the trend. Some units were rotated out of Rabaul for rest and refit. Others were consolidated or withdrawn entirely. By autumn, air groups that had dominated the region the previous year were shadows of themselves. American air operations expanded in scale and frequency, facing diminishing opposition. This was the real achievement of the vertical trap. It did not win glory in single dramatic duels. It hollowed out an air force over months. It turned experienced pilots into cautious pilots into fatigued ones, and fatigued units into ineffective ones. The Zero's strengths, maneuverability, agility, close-range fighting, were never disproven. They were simply rendered irrelevant by a method that refused to acknowledge them. By the end of 1943, Japanese air power in the New Guinea theater had not been defeated in a climactic battle. It had been drained. The P-38s that flew high, dove fast, and climbed away had imposed a cost structure the Zero could not survive. The sky had become a place where choice belonged to one side, and once choice disappears, so does the fight. For the American pilots flying P-38s in late 1943, the effectiveness of the vertical trap was undeniable. But it didn't feel like triumph. Combat reports from the period are telling not for what they celebrate, but for what they omit. There is little bravado, little language of rivalry or heroism. Instead, they read like technical logs. Altitudes, speeds, angles, ammunition expended. The men executing the tactic understood they had found something that worked, and that understanding carried its own weight. This was not the kind of air combat most pilots imagined when they trained. Early war dogfights were described as contests of nerve and skill, where outcomes felt uncertain until the last moment. The vertical trap removed much of that uncertainty. When executed correctly, it produced a predictable result. The enemy rarely had a clean chance to fight back. The kill came quickly, often without prolonged maneuvering. Then the pilot climbed away and reset, preparing to do it again. That repetition changed how combat felt. Some pilots described it later as work. Necessary, exhausting, and impersonal. They flew multiple engagements in a single mission, each following the same sequence: dive, fire, zoom, roll, reset. Victory stopped feeling dramatic and started feeling procedural. When enemy aircraft disintegrated in the gun sight, it was not met with celebration. It was confirmation that the sequence had been executed correctly. Captain Thomas Lynch, one of the pilots who helped push vertical tactics into regular use, embodied that mindset. He was not known for flamboyance. His focus was survival and results. He trained younger pilots to think in terms of energy and position, not bravery, fly high, strike fast, leave before the fight becomes fair. Lynch's record reflected the approach: dozens of missions flown, confirmed victories achieved, losses minimized. He was killed in March 1944 during a low-level strafing mission, not in a classic dogfight, a reminder that no tactic eliminated risk entirely. Others carried the lessons forward. Pilots like Richard Bong, who would become the highest-scoring American ace, absorbed the discipline of energy fighting early. Bong's later success owed much to the environment created by leaders who taught him when not to turn, when to disengage, and when patience mattered more than aggression. The vertical trap was not about chasing kills. It was about controlling exposure. On the Japanese side, the emotional toll took a different form. Surviving pilots reported growing frustration rather than fear. They were trained to fight by closing, turning, and pressing the attack. Against P-38s that refused to slow down, those instincts became liabilities. Younger pilots, arriving with fewer hours and less combat seasoning, struggled to understand why their skills failed them. Veterans watched them die quickly, often in their first engagements, with little opportunity to intervene. Some Japanese pilots later described this period as the moment air combat lost its meaning. In 1942, skill could compensate for disadvantage. In 1943, it could not. The Americans had changed the terms. Encounters no longer felt like contests. They felt like ambushes repeated at scale. The psychological effect was corrosive. Pilots requested transfers. Others reported illness. Mission effectiveness declined even when aircraft were available. By mid-1943, training pipelines could not compensate for losses. New pilots arrived with 200 to 300 flight hours, compared to significantly more for their American counterparts. Gunnery training was limited. Tactical instruction focused on formation and aerobatics rather than energy management. When these pilots met P-38s flying vertical trap tactics, there was little room for adaptation. The engagement was over before learning could occur. Attrition extended beyond aircraft and pilots. Maintenance crews worked continuously, but damaged aircraft accumulated faster than they could be repaired. Fuel shortages and spare part shortages compounded delays. Units that had once flown multiple daily sorties found themselves grounded for lack of serviceable machines. The pressure intensified on those who remain operational, increasing fatigue and reducing judgment. American pilots were aware of the imbalance. Some later admitted discomfort with the efficiency of it. They were not defeating equally matched opponents in dramatic duels. They were executing a method that left the enemy little agency. The enemy still fought bravely. That bravery simply no longer mattered. The vertical trap did not test courage. It tested understanding. This distinction followed many pilots home. Those who survived their tours returned physically intact but altered. They had learned to apply violence mechanically, to separate emotion from action in 30-second sequences, repeated dozens of times. Some spoke about it decades later, not with pride or shame, but with distance, as if recalling something done by someone else. By the end of 1943, the Pacific Air War over New Guinea was no longer about proving superiority. That question had been answered. It was about sustaining pressure until resistance collapsed. The vertical trap was a tool in that process. It worked because it removed mutuality from combat, and once mutuality is gone, what remains is not glory, but inevitability. When the fighting over New Guinea finally slowed in late 1943 and early 1944, it did not end with a decisive aerial battle or a dramatic last stand. It ended with absence. Fewer Japanese fighters rose to meet American bombers. Fewer interceptions formed. Raids that once drew 30 or 40 zeros were answered by 5 or 10, sometimes none at all. The sky emptied not because Japan lacked pilots willing to fight, but because the cost of fighting had become impossible to justify. By December 1943, Japanese fighter strength at Rabaul had fallen catastrophically. Units that had dominated the region a year earlier were reduced to fractions of their former size. Aircraft availability collapsed. Pilot rosters thinned. Mission abort rates climbed, not due to mechanical failure, but because flight leaders judged engagements unwinnable. These decisions were rational. They were also a quiet admission that air superiority had been lost. The vertical trap was not the sole cause of that collapse. Logistics, training limitations, fuel shortages, and allied industrial output all played their part. But the tactic accelerated every weakness. It punished undertrained pilots immediately. It magnified maintenance shortfalls by damaging aircraft faster than they could be repaired. It forced commanders into impossible choices: engage and lose fighters unsustainably, or refuse and surrender the initiative. Japanese pilots who survived carried a particular kind of understanding. Many later described 1943 as the year air combat changed shape. In 1942, defeat still felt personal, outflown, outmaneuvered, outshot. In 1943, defeat felt structural. The Americans no longer fought the zero, they fought physics. Skill still mattered, but only within boundaries imposed by altitude, speed, and energy retention. Outside those boundaries, courage could not compensate. Some veterans articulated the distinction with weary clarity. Earlier in the war, fighting implied reciprocity. Both sides committed, both sides risked, and outcomes were uncertain. Under the vertical trap, encounters felt different. The American fighters chose when to appear and when to leave. The Japanese pilots reacted. The fight belonged to one side before it began. For American pilots, the aftermath was quieter but no less complex. Many understood that what they had done was effective, necessary, and deeply impersonal. They had perfected a method that reduced air combat to applied geometry. Altitude converted to speed. Speed converted back to altitude, repeated until the enemy ran out of options. The method worked precisely because it eliminated chance. That elimination came at a cost. Pilots who flew 60, 80, even 100 missions returned home physically intact but mentally altered. They had learned to execute violence efficiently, repeatedly, without the emotional framing that made sense of it afterward. There was little room for heroism in a 30-second dive and climb sequence. There was only execution and reset. The vertical trap gradually faded from prominence as the war evolved. Japanese air opposition declined sharply after mid-1944. New American aircraft entered service. The P-51 took over long-range escort roles. The Corsair dominated other theaters. The P-38 itself became less central, its distinctive twin booms more likely to be seen in photographs than in combat reports. Yet the legacy of the tactic endured. Modern fighter training treats energy management, vertical maneuvering, and boom and zoom attacks as fundamentals. They are taught through diagrams and simulations, stripped of the desperation that birthed them over New Guinea. Students learn the mechanics without the context, that these ideas were not elegant theories, but survival adaptations forged by pilots who refused to keep dying in fair fights. The P-38 Lightning became a museum aircraft, remembered for its silhouette and its range. Less often remembered is that, for a crucial 18 months, it carried a method that broke one of the most feared fighter forces in the world, not by matching its strengths, but by refusing them entirely. The vertical trap did not prove the zero inferior. It proved that superiority depends on where the fight is allowed to happen. Wars are often remembered as contests of valor, sacrifice, and evenly matched opponents. The truth is more uncomfortable. Wars are frequently decided by one side finding a way to make the fight uneven, then exploiting that imbalance relentlessly until the other side can no longer continue. Over New Guinea, that imbalance was altitude and speed. The P-38 squadrons found it, refined it, and applied it until resistance collapsed. The men who flew those missions returned to a world that wanted simple stories. Heroes, aces, victories. What they carried back instead was a quieter knowledge that winning sometimes means refusing to fight the fight your enemy is prepared for, and that effectiveness can feel disturbingly empty once the shooting stops. The vertical trap worked. That was its purpose. What it meant afterward, what it cost the men who executed it and the men who endured it, was something no tactical manual could capture. When the engines were silent and the sky was empty, all that remained was the understanding that the nature of the fight had changed, and that change had ended careers, units, and lives without offering the consolation of a fair contest. That is why Japanese zero aces quit the fight, not because they lacked skill or courage, but because continuing meant entering a system designed to kill them efficiently. And that is why the P-38's legacy in the Pacific is not just a matter of aircraft performance, but of a tactical idea that removed mutuality from combat and, in doing so, decided the war in the air long before the war itself was over.